Hello again. Today we're going to talk about one of the most complex interviews in the full loop interview for a meta TPM. Stay with me and you'll do great. The main goal of the system design interview is to evaluate or assess your abilities or skills when it comes to putting a system together end to end. In this interview, there are no rights or wrongs, meaning that as long as you can support every single of your answers to the questions, you are going to be okay. When it comes to time, we're going to have exactly the same time that we have for the rest of the interviews, which is 45 minutes in total, 5 minutes. Remember, it's for you to ask questions to the interviewer, so don't take into account that time. So you will effectively have 40 minutes in order to answer all the questions associated to this interview. This interview is going to be one single open question that is going to ask you to design or put together a system or feature for an existing system. And then afterwards, there are going to be a set of follow-up questions, and the interviewer is going to ask you depending on your answer. This interview has no structure, no predefined questions. It can be anything, so hence the complexity that is associated to it. But here we will try to put a structure on it so it's easier for you to tackle it. So for starters, let's try to divide this interview in 3 different parts. The first part is going to be related to the problem definition. The second part is going to be related to the user experience or user interface, and the third part to the technical architecture. In the problem definition part, as its name says, you will define the problem. You will have to understand what are you trying to solve. Therefore, the very first question that you have to ask is, what are we trying to solve? What's the problem that we're trying to solve here? Easy peasy. Then move to the goal. Ask, what's the goal that we have once we put together this system, or what's the goal that we are aiming for? If the interviewer doesn't give you a goal, so you will have to propose one. Go for the regular ones. Growth, engagement could be another one. It will depend on the system that you are being asked for, if it is web, if it is an app, and depend the usage of that particular system and the people that you're catering for. Then the next set of questions should be related to demographics. You should ask stuff about what's the segment, what are the countries, is this an MVP, is this a full-fledged system, are we adding a new feature? Then the next set of questions should be related to the platforms, meaning first operating systems, and then the devices that you are going to support. Later on, you will move to the set of questions that are completely specific to the scenario that you've been posed with. I cannot anticipate here what you're going to be asked. So therefore, you will have to think twice about what are the questions that you need to ask in order to further define this scenario. Then the next step is to define the use cases. It's not about describing and making like a long essay about each one of the use cases. It's just listing them for your clarity. What's the stuff that you're going to do here? What's the stuff that you're going to focus? It's important here that you are able to prioritize and see what are the most important use cases that you have to put there in order to achieve the goal. Otherwise, the interviewer is gonna think that, well, the candidate is just putting together 20 use cases just to cover the most, but it's not prioritizing, it's not restricting the system to the most vital ones to achieve the goal. Therefore, this person probably is not used to prioritize in the proper way. So in order to give the interviewer a negative signal, focus yourself on those use cases which are the most important. Once you have defined and clarified all your doubts about what has to be built, the next step is to define the success metrics. It's very important that you do this. Otherwise, you're going to fail this interview. It's important that once you build the system, there has to be a way to know that you've been successful. There has to be alignment, full alignment between the metrics, the goal, and the problem. The next part is the UX/UI definition. And here, I need you to bring your magic up. There are no specific recommendations when it comes to this part, because as you can understand, it's completely dependent on the scenario or dependent on the question that you've been asked. But the only thing that I can recommend you here is take into account the use cases that you define in the first part of the interview. Please remember to take notes of those use cases. It's very important. We're going to use them here in the second part, and we're going to use them in the third part of the interview. So use that list of use cases and start visualizing you using the device and the system, and how will the system behave while you are doing all those user journeys. Describe the system in as much detail as you can. The third part of this interview is a technical architecture definition. Here you're going to be asked to put together a diagram of the architecture, and most of the questions during this interview are going to happen during this part. So it's important that you leave plenty of time for it. Usually we take a lot of time in the first two parts, and we found ourselves with little time for this part. Therefore, you have two ways of tackling this part of the interview. One, either you take into account all the use cases and you start drawing your diagram from left to right, putting together all the components and relationships between those components, or you follow an iterative approach in which you take one use case and you depict all the components end to end, from the front end to the data ledger. And then you take the second use case and you overlay all those components over the first set of components that you put for the first use case. So therefore, you are kind of building the diagram little by little. The second approach has the advantage that it's going to show the interviewer that you know what you are doing, even though that you don't complete all the use cases. Imagine that you have 8 use cases to cover for, and you have little time to do that. So go one by one and define all those 3 or 4 main use cases in a proper way, so the interviewer will have the necessary signal to say, yeah, this person knows what they are doing when it comes to technical architecture. It's important that you brush off your knowledge on systems design. You have to know all the recent technologies. It doesn't have to be specific products, but mostly about technologies and the type of components. It is also important for you to brush off your knowledge when it comes to data technologies, because those kind of questions are always there. Questions like, what data technology are you going to use for that repository? Why are you using that technology for that specific repository? It is okay, you can find on the web information about all these technologies. It's super easy to find. And last but not least, identify common strategies for achieving high availability, scalability, security, and also reduce latency. You will see that there are common patterns when it comes to architecture or architectural patterns to use for each one of these different characteristics. When it comes to the technical diagram, just follow the regular approach of a 3-tiered system. You will have the front end or client, you will have the back end or application layer, and you will have the data layer. It doesn't mean that you will put 3 boxes there and that's it, because you're going to fail the interview. You will have to provide much more detail than that. But in your mind, you have to structure it in that way and make the diagram very clear. Otherwise, you're going to start receiving questions from the interviewer in order to clarify the diagram, which will subtract time from the interview, and that doesn't play well for you. So remember, provide clarity on your diagram, or basically the diagram is going to look like this to the interviewer. When it comes to time, we will have 45 minutes. Remember, 5 minutes at the end. For the whole interview, we will have 45 minutes. 5 minutes by the end of the interview will be for you to actually ask questions about the company or the role. Then you will have effectively 40 minutes to answer all the questions associated to the interview. The recommendation here will be to make a 10-15-15 split for all these parts, meaning 10 minutes for the problem definition, 15 minutes for the UI UX, 15 minutes for the technical architecture. If you have to sacrifice time in any of these parts, it will be on the UI UX. and probably give time to the technical architecture part. So be aware of the time, have a chronometer or something like that, a clock, so you can time yourself and you do not exceed these times. It's not that the interviewer is going to give you negative comments or remarks or negative feedback about you if you kind of use a different approach of the one that I'm mentioning. Is that according to my experience, this is the best way to distribute the time. Also, what kind of questions would you expect in this interview? First, it will be trade-offs and why. The interviewer is going to challenge your answers. And it's going to ask you, why did you choose to do it in that way and not in this other way? You should be able to actually go for the two options, evaluate pros and cons, and then make a decision and say, the option that I took is better than the other one that you're proposing because A, B, C, and D. Also, you're going to be presented with hypothetical questions, meaning what if this situation happens? How would your system tackle it? Be prepared to answer questions about security, scalability, latency, and how to enhance all these characteristics in your system. Before you go, subscribe to my channel, hit the notification button so you can receive all new videos with super useful information about TPMs. And if you're interested in knowing the overarching process of interviews at Meta, look for this video in my channel. Remember, be kind, be smart, have fun.